It was nearing midnight when Emily pulled up to the small, isolated hospital where she worked the night shift as a nurse. The rain pelted her windshield in heavy sheets, making the world outside feel distant, unreal. She sighed, wiping away the fog that clung to the glass. The night shifts had always unnerved her, but lately there had been an edge to them that she couldn't shake, a creeping sense of being watched, even when the halls were empty. She tried to brush it off. Fatigue could play tricks on the mind, especially at 3 a.m. when the world felt as though it had forgotten you existed. The hospital, like most rural ones, was quiet at night. Too quiet. Only a few patients stayed in the long-term care wing, and the emergency department was rarely busy. But tonight, something felt different the moment she stepped inside. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, casting an eerie, sterile glow on the linoleum floors. The air felt colder than usual, almost damp, and the silence was thick enough to choke on. As Emily made her way to the nurse's station, she noticed the old security guard, Hank, wasn't sitting at his usual spot by the entrance. That was odd. Hank never missed a shift, and he was always there to greet her with a tired smile and a thermos full of coffee. A little unnerved, she continued down the hallway, the echo of her footsteps making her feel painfully alone. The first few hours of her shift passed without incident, save for the occasional beeping from the monitors in the long-term care rooms. But around 2 a.m., Emily heard something, a soft tapping sound, rhythmic and steady. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't unusual to hear strange noises in a hospital, but this felt different. It was close. Too close. She stepped out into the hall, peering around the corner, but saw nothing. The sound stopped abruptly, but leaving only the droning hum of the hospital's ventilation system in its wake. She returned to the nurse's station, trying to push the sound from her mind. Perhaps it was just the pipes, or maybe Hank was playing a prank on her. But the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from one of the patient rooms at the far end of the hall. Room 304. Emily hesitated, but duty called, and she made her way down the corridor, the sound growing louder with each step. As she approached room 304, the tapping stopped. Her hand hovered over the door handle for a moment before she slowly turned it and pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the faint glow from the monitor next to the bed. The patient, a frail, elderly woman who had been comatose for weeks, lay still beneath the sheets. Emily stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for anything unusual. Nothing seemed out of place, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the woman's eyes snapped open. Emily gasped, nearly stumbling backward. The patient had been unresponsive for as long as she had been on duty, and there had been no indication she would ever wake up. But now, those eyes, glassy and empty, were locked on hers. The woman's mouth twitched, and a raspy whisper escaped her lips. "He's here." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Her instinct was to flee, but she couldn't leave the woman in this state. She approached the bed cautiously, trying to calm her racing heart. "Who's here?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. The woman's eyes rolled back in her head, and her body convulsed for a moment before going still again. The monitor let out a high-pitched whine as her heart rate spiked, then plummeted. Emily rushed to her side, calling for help, but as she reached for the call button, the lights in the room flickered and went out. Panic gripped her. In the sudden darkness, she fumbled for her flashlight, but the moment she clicked it on, she wished she hadn't. She hadn't. Standing at the foot of the bed was a shadow, a figure tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by darkness. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. Was this some kind of hallucination? Stress? Fatigue? But no, she could feel the presence of something unnatural in the room, something cold and malevolent. Suddenly, the figure lunged at her, and she screamed, stumbling out of the room and slamming the door behind her. The hallway lights flickered back on, and the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted, but the terror remained. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to compose herself. What had she just seen? She ran to the nurse's station, frantically paging the doctor on call. But when he arrived, there was nothing unusual in room 304. The patient lay still, her monitor showing a steady heartbeat. There was no shadow, no sign of the figure that had terrified Emily moments before. The doctor looked at her with concern, clearly skeptical of her story, but she knew what she had seen. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't stress. For the rest of the night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in the hospital seemed to move, and the walls themselves seemed to close in on her. When morning finally came, she left the hospital as quickly as she could, her hands still shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She didn't return the next night, or the night after. In fact, she never went back. She quit her job, unable to face whatever haunted that hospital in the dead of night. But the image of the shadowy figure stayed with her, lurking in the corners of her mind, a constant reminder that some things are better left unseen. And sometimes, when she lies in bed at night, she still hears the tapping. It was just past 11 p.m. when Jake clocked in for his night shift at the gas station. The place was isolated, sitting on the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. The kind of station truckers pass through late at night, looking for a quick fill-up and maybe a cup of coffee to keep them awake on the long, empty highway. Jake had been working there for months, and while he didn't love the job, the pay was decent and the shifts were quiet. But lately, things had been off. It started with the lights. The flickering fluorescent bulbs above the gas pumps would randomly blink out, casting the lot into darkness. At first, Jake chalked it up to bad wiring or an electrical issue, but then they'd flicker back to life, buzzing angrily as though protesting their sudden blackout. He reported it, but no one came to fix it. It didn't bother him much during the day, but at night, when everything was still and silent, the darkness seemed alive, watching. That night, the station felt especially cold. The heaters were running, but no warmth reached Jake, and a strange tension filled the air as if the very walls were holding their breath. His coworker, Sam, had just left for the night, and Jake settled into the silence, sipping stale coffee from the pot behind the counter. The low hum of the overhead lights and the occasional gust of wind were his only company. Around midnight, the phone rang. Jake stared at it for a moment, confused. No one ever called the station this late. He picked up the receiver and pressed it to his ear. Hello? Nothing. Just static. Jake hung up, feeling uneasy. He glanced out the large glass windows toward the pumps, scanning the lot. It was empty, save for the rustling trees at the edge of the woods, their branches swaying in the wind. He shook his head, trying to shake the eerie feeling creeping up his spine. But a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, Jake answered more quickly. Hello? Who's there? Again, nothing. Just the same, low static. Jake's fingers tightened around the phone as he listened closer, trying to make sense of the noise. Beneath the static, there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. He slammed the phone down, his heart pounding in his chest. What the hell was going on? The wind outside picked up, howling against the windows, and the lights above flickered, casting the station into brief moments of darkness. Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He was being watched. He could feel it. The oppressive silence between the gusts of wind seemed to stretch, as though something was out there, waiting. Suddenly, the chime above the entrance door rang out, echoing through the station. Jake's head snapped toward the door, but no one had entered. The door stood wide open, letting in the cold, crisp night air. A gust of wind rattled the racks of snacks and toppled a few bags of chips to the floor. Jake rushed to the door, slamming it shut and locking it, his pulse racing. He scanned the lot again, but it was still empty. No cars, no people. Just the silent forest beyond the gas pumps, the trees swaying in the wind like dark sentinels. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Maybe the wind had just forced the door open. That had to be it. But when he turned around to head back to the counter, his blood ran cold. The shelves, the racks of snacks and drinks. They weren't the same. Every single item on the shelves had been turned. All the labels now faced the back. Every bottle, every bag, every can turned away from him in perfect unnerving alignment. Jake stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. There was no way this could have happened without him hearing something. He was the only one in the station, the only one who could have moved anything, and he sure as hell hadn't touched the shelves. The phone rang again. Jake didn't want to answer it. He knew deep down that whatever was happening wasn't right. It wasn't natural, but he couldn't just ignore it, not when the ringing cut through the silence like a knife. He walked slowly to the counter, his legs feeling like lead. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the receiver. Hello. His voice was barely a whisper. This time there was no static, no breathing. Instead, a voice, deep, distorted, almost inhuman, came through the line. I'm watching you. Jake's heart nearly stopped. He dropped the phone, stumbling backward as the lights flickered violently, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. The wind outside howled and the door rattled in its frame, as though something was trying to force its way inside. He grabbed his phone, fumbling to call Sam, but the screen wouldn't unlock. The device was dead. The lights above continued to flicker, plunging the station into darkness, then briefly illuminating it again. In one of those brief flashes of light, Jake saw something, or someone, standing outside, just beyond the pumps. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The figure stood motionless, staring at him with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he bolted for the door, desperate to get out, to escape whatever was stalking him. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the key. The wind outside screamed against the building, and he could feel something watching him, its gaze burning into his back. Finally, the door gave way, and Jake sprinted outside, his feet slipping on the wet pavement as he raced toward his car. He could feel it now, the presence following him, drawing closer with every step. He didn't dare look back. He reached his car, threw open the door, and jumped inside. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The engine roared to life, and he tore out of the parking lot, his tires screeching as he sped down the empty highway. Jake didn't stop driving until he reached the next town, miles away from the gas station. He never went back to work. The next day, the police went to the station after it failed to open. They found the door unlocked and the lights still flickering, but no one inside. Everything was as Jake had left it, except for one thing. Every shelf, every item, every single product in the store had been turned once again. This time, all facing the windows, as though they were watching. No one ever figured out what happened that night. But Jake knew. Something was out there, and it was still watching. It was a quiet town tucked away in the mountains where nothing much ever happened. Claire had recently started her new job as a night security guard at a sprawling office building on the outskirts of town. The building itself was modern, with sleek glass walls and long, dimly lit corridors that felt out of place in such a remote area. During the day, it bustled with employees, but by night, it was completely deserted, except for Claire. She had taken the job for the pay, which was surprisingly good for a small town. The work was simple enough. Monitor the cameras, patrol the hallways, and make sure the building was locked up tight. The first few nights passed without incident. The silence was unnerving, but she grew accustomed to it until that one night, the night that changed everything. It was just after midnight when Claire first noticed something strange on the security monitors. One of the cameras on the third floor flickered, then went dark for a moment before coming back online. She stared at the screen, waiting for the image to stabilize when she saw it. Movement. A shadow, long and twisted, slithered across the hallway just out of the camera's range. Her stomach churned as she leaned closer to the monitor. The building was supposed to be empty. She had done her rounds, checked every office, every corner, but there was something or someone there now. She switched to the next camera, the one that should have picked up the figure as it moved down the hallway. But there was nothing. Just the empty corridor, lit by the dim overhead lights that flickered every now and then. Claire tried to shake off the unease settling into her bones. It was probably a glitch, she told herself. Maybe some trick of the lights. Still, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She grabbed her flashlight and radio and decided to check it out, even though every instinct screamed at her to stay behind the safety of her desk. As she rode the elevator up to the third floor, the air in the building seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights seemed distant, muted, as though the building itself was holding its breath. When the doors slid open with a quiet ding, she stepped into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The corridor stretched out before her, long and empty, lined with glass office doors that reflected her flashlight back at her. Everything was still, silent, but that nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. She walked slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through the dim light, glancing from door to door. Each office she passed was empty, just as it should be. But then she heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She swept the flashlight around, the beam landing on the end of the hallway where the emergency stairs were. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. The scraping noise came again, louder this time, like nails being dragged slowly across concrete. Her throat tightened as she took a step closer to the door. It was probably a raccoon or some animal that had gotten inside. At least, that's what she tried to convince herself. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. As she reached the door, she hesitated. The darkness beyond it seemed deeper, thicker than it should have been, like the stairwell had been swallowed up by something unseen. She pushed the door open a little wider, her flashlight barely piercing the black void beyond. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, but the scraping sound had stopped. Claire took a deep breath and stepped into the stairwell, her flashlight bouncing off the concrete walls. The stairwell spiraled up into the darkness above, but something about it felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, like she had walked into a space that wasn't meant for her. She started to descend, her footsteps slow and deliberate, but halfway down the stairs, the temperature dropped suddenly, so sharply that her breath misted in front of her. That was when she heard it again, scraping, but this time it was coming from behind her. Claire spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing, just the empty stairs stretching up to the third floor. But the noise persisted, louder now, like something was crawling up the walls toward her. Panic set in, and she turned to bolt down the stairs. But as she rounded the next corner, her flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, she saw it, just for a second. A figure. Tall, impossibly tall, crouched on the landing below her. Its limbs were grotesquely long, its body twisted and distorted like it didn't belong in this world. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and its face, if it could be called a face, was nothing but a dark, hollow void. The flashlight came back on, and the figure was gone. But Claire didn't wait to see if it would return. She ran. Sprinting down the stairs, she could hear it behind her, its claws scraping along the walls, closer and closer. Her heart pounded in her ears as she burst through the door at the bottom of the stairs and into the lobby. The lights flickered overhead as she raced to the security desk. She slammed her hand on the panic button, sending an alert to the local police. But as she glanced at the security monitors, her blood ran cold. The cameras showed nothing. The third-floor hallway, the stairwell, the lobby. It was all empty. But Claire knew what she had seen, what she had heard. She waited, trembling behind the desk, her eyes locked on the stairwell door. The police arrived within minutes, but by then the building was silent again, the air still and cold. They searched every floor, every office, but found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no sign of anyone or anything that shouldn't have been there. Claire quit the next day. Weeks later, the new security guard went missing. The police found the building empty, the security footage showing the same flickering lights and empty hallways. But on the footage from the stairwell, they found something else, just a glimpse. A tall, twisted figure crouched in the shadows, watching, waiting. The clock struck 11:45 p.m. as David pulled into the parking lot of the decrepit old factory he'd been hired to guard. It was his first night on the job, a simple security shift that was supposed to be routine. The factory had been abandoned for decades, but recently, a developer bought the property and planned to renovate it. Until the work began, someone needed to keep an eye on the place, mainly to deter trespassers and vandals. The building itself was enormous, sprawling over several acres, with broken windows and rusted machinery scattered throughout. Vines and weeds had overtaken much of the exterior, giving it an almost haunting appearance. The night air was thick with humidity, and the wind howled through the cracked walls, creating an eerie whistling that echoed through the desolate space. David parked his car near the entrance, grabbed his flashlight, and sighed. He wasn't thrilled about spending the night in this crumbling ruin, but the pay was good, and he didn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends that people loved to tell about places like this. As he stepped inside, the smell of mildew and decay hit him. The factory was a maze of empty rooms, long, dark corridors, and staircases that led to nowhere. Most of the electricity had been cut off years ago, leaving only a few dim, flickering lights hanging from the ceiling. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional creak of metal or distant drip of water leaking from somewhere above. David's job was simple: walk the perimeter every hour, check for signs of break-ins, and make sure no one was wandering around the property. Easy enough, he thought, shining his flashlight down the dark hallway. As he began his first patrol, the only sound was the crunch of his boots on the cracked floor. The first hour passed uneventfully. David completed his rounds, checked the doors, and returned to the small security office near the front entrance. The quiet stillness was unsettling, but he brushed it off. He sat down in the worn chair behind the desk, keeping one eye on the flickering monitors that showed the grainy footage from the few remaining security cameras scattered throughout the factory. Most of the cameras were dead, but one in particular, positioned in a hallway on the second floor, had a habit of flickering in and out. It was during his second patrol when things started to feel off. David was walking through one of the larger workrooms, his flashlight beam illuminating rows of rusted machines and conveyor belts long since abandoned. As he crossed the room, he heard it, a soft, clinking sound, like metal tapping on metal. He stopped, shining his light in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. He took a step forward, straining his ears, but the sound had stopped. His pulse quickened, but he told himself it was just the building settling, or maybe some small animal scurrying around in the dark. Still, the quiet that followed felt heavy, oppressive. As David moved down one of the narrow hallways leading to the second floor, the air grew colder, and he noticed his breath misting in front of him. He stopped again, his flashlight flickering for just a second. It came back on almost immediately, but in that split moment of darkness, he could have sworn he saw something at the far end of the hall. A figure, tall and hunched, just standing there, watching. David's heart pounded in his chest, but when the flashlight beam steadied, the figure was gone. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. The shadows in this place seemed alive, constantly shifting and changing with every step he took. He finished his patrol quickly, eager to get back to the safety of the security office. But as he reached the stairwell leading back to the first floor, he heard it again, the clinking sound, this time louder and more distinct. It echoed from the floor above, the sound of something metallic being dragged across the ground. David froze, his skin prickling with unease. He knew no one else was supposed to be in the building. His mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe a window had blown open and knocked something over. Or maybe there were vandals who had slipped in when he wasn't looking. He couldn't ignore it. He had to check it out. With a deep breath, he ascended the stairs to the second floor. The temperature dropped even more, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. His flashlight flickered again, and this time it took longer to come back on. The hallway stretched out before him, long and empty, except for the rows of broken windows lining the walls. The clinking noise was closer now, coming from one of the rooms up ahead. He approached cautiously, his hand gripping the flashlight tightly. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and the sound was definitely coming from inside. He pushed the door open, the rusty hinges creaking loudly, and stepped inside. The room was large, filled with old machinery and a massive, rusted conveyor belt that stretched from one end to the other. The air was frigid, and there was a smell, something foul and decaying, like rotting meat. David's stomach turned as he shined the light across the room. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but then his flashlight caught movement in the far corner, near one of the large machines. Something was there. Something crouched low to the ground. David's breath caught in his throat as the beam of light fell on it. It was a figure, human in shape, but wrong. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a gaunt, skeletal frame. It had no eyes, just deep, hollow sockets where its eyes should have been, and its mouth was wide, unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, broken teeth. The figure was hunched over, dragging what looked like a long, rusted chain across the floor. David couldn't move. His body was frozen in place as the creature slowly turned its head toward him, sensing his presence. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that rattled deep in his chest, and began to stand, its long, bony limbs unfolding in a grotesque manner. Without thinking, David turned and ran, his heart slamming against his ribs as he bolted down the hallway. He could hear it behind him, the clinking of the chain, followed by the soft scrape of its feet as it crawled after him. He didn't dare look back. He reached the stairwell, practically throwing himself down the steps as the sound grew louder, closer. His mind raced, desperate for escape. As he reached the bottom floor, he darted toward the exit, his lungs burning as he pushed the door open and stumbled into the cold night air. David didn't stop running until he reached his car. His hands shook violently as he fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. He sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look back at the building looming behind him. He quit the next morning. He never went back, and no one else took his place. Weeks later, the developer abandoned the project, claiming the factory was too unstable to renovate. Locals said it was cursed, haunted by the souls of the workers who had died in a fire decades ago, their spirits twisted and trapped in the darkness. But David knew better. There was something far worse than spirits in that building. Something that still lurked in the shadows, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter. It was a little after midnight when Amber pulled into the parking lot of the old motel, the rain coming down in thick sheets, blurring the lines of the dark road behind her. She had been driving for hours, desperately trying to outrun a storm that seemed to follow her every turn. Exhausted, with no real destination in mind, she saw the faded neon sign flickering through the downpour. Lakewood Motel, vacancy. The place looked worn down, almost forgotten, with cracked windows and peeling paint, but she didn't care. All she wanted was a bed, somewhere to close her eyes and escape the relentless rain. She grabbed her things and dashed inside, the dim light from the lobby casting strange shadows as she approached the front desk. The lobby was small, smelling faintly of mildew and damp carpet. An old man sat behind the desk, his face pale and drawn, with deep-set eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. "Just passing through?" he asked, his voice raspy, almost a whisper. "Yeah," Amber said, trying to ignore the odd feeling crawling up her spine. "I need a room for the night." The man handed her a key without another word, his bony fingers brushing against hers for just a second too long. The touch sent a shiver down her arm, but she smiled politely, eager to get out of the eerie little office. As she turned to leave, the man cleared his throat. "Don't go near room 6, he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain outside. Amber stopped, looking back at him with confusion. "Excuse me? Room 6, he repeated, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's out of order. Don't go near it." Amber nodded slowly, not bothering to ask any more questions. She just wanted to get to her room, take a hot shower, and forget about the strange encounter. Her room was on the second floor, down a long, narrow hallway that felt far too quiet. The motel was empty, she could tell by the silence, but every step she took echoed against the walls. She found her room, room 8, and pushed the door open. The room was sparse but clean enough, with a worn bedspread and flickering TV in the corner. She tossed her bag onto the bed, then walked over to the window, pulling the curtains aside to look out into the storm. Through the heavy rain, she could see the row of motel rooms below, the lights flickering weakly under the awning. But something caught her eye. Room 6. The door was slightly ajar, swinging ever so slightly in the wind. She thought about what the old man had said. "Don't go near room 6. Curiosity gnawed at her. Why was it out of order? And if no one was supposed to be in there, why was the door open? She tried to shake off the feeling, but it stayed with her as she showered, dressed, and sat on the edge of the bed. The rain beat against the window, and every now and then a gust of wind would rattle the door. The storm outside was getting worse, but it was the nagging thought of room 6 that kept her from relaxing. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing her flashlight, she slipped on her jacket and left her room. The hallway was as empty as before, the air heavy with a strange, unshakable tension. As she descended the stairs, the rain pounded against the metal railing, creating a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking toward room 6. The door was still ajar, the faint light from inside flickering as if someone was moving around in there. She hesitated, hearing the old man's warning echo in her mind, but the pull was too strong, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Slowly, she approached the room. The door creaked open wider as she reached for the handle, and the moment she stepped inside, the air grew thick with a cold, unnatural chill. The room was in complete disarray. Furniture overturned, the bed ripped apart, and the smell of something foul and metallic hanging in the air. Her flashlight flickered as she stepped deeper inside, her breath hitching in her throat. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that ran from floor to ceiling, as if something had tried desperately to claw its way out. But it was the mirror on the far wall that drew her attention. It was large, cracked in several places, but something about it was wrong. Its surface seemed to ripple slightly, like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. Amber stepped closer, her flashlight flickering again, and then she saw it. Her reflection, standing there, staring back at her. But it wasn't quite right. The reflection didn't mimic her movements. It stood still, smiling faintly, even as Amber's own face remained blank with confusion. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, as her reflection slowly tilted its head, that strange smile widening. Then, before she could react, the reflection raised its hand, pressing it against the other side of the glass. Amber stumbled backward, her flashlight falling to the floor, casting the room in a dim, erratic light. The reflection pressed harder against the mirror as if trying to push its way through. The glass began to crack, spiderwebbing out from where its hand touched. Panic surged through her as she backed toward the door, her eyes locked on the mirror. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something alive. Its eyes were dark, hollow, filled with a malevolent hunger as it pressed harder, the cracks in the glass spreading. Suddenly, there was a loud, sharp crack, and the mirror shattered. But instead of glass falling, something else came through. A figure, identical to her, crawling out of the broken shards. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't as it slithered toward her. Amber bolted, slamming the door behind her as she raced through the rain back to the lobby. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She burst through the front door, drenched and trembling. The old man was still behind the desk, his eyes slowly lifting to meet hers. He didn't look surprised. "You went near room 6, he said quietly. Amber shook her head, struggling to form words. There's something in there. A reflection. It tried to." The old man sighed deeply, pushing a small book across the counter toward her. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age. He didn't say anything as she opened it, her hands trembling. The book was filled with names, dates, each one scrawled in messy handwriting. Pages upon pages of entries. She flipped through, her eyes scanning the names until she found something that made her blood run cold. Her name was there, Amber Hayes, with tonight's date written beside it. She stared at the book, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Her name, written down long before she ever set foot in this place. "You should have listened," the old man whispered. "No one who goes near room 6 ever leaves." Amber backed away from the desk, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She turned to run, but froze in her tracks. Standing in the doorway, dripping with rain, was her reflection. It smiled, that same twisted smile, as it raised a hand in greeting. And then everything went dark.